Well, we are back on the set-out shed for the Handcar. This is part 3. We're building the roof. Now, when last we looked at this project, we were just finishing up the walls and the front gable. And getting ready to put the gabled section of the roof on. That involves building roof trusses here for this section of the building. And then rebuilding, I kind of messed up the gable for the rear wall. So I thought I'll go ahead and build the trusses and then match that gable to the trusses. That rear wall is particularly tricky because it's at an angle to the rest of the building because the building sits right up against the backdrop. And I figured those angles slightly wrong, and so I just pulled that gable off, and I'm going to redesign it and put it back on the building. Now, in the last show, we looked at how the trusses themselves were actually built, matching the pitch on that front gable and then creating a template. I was able to build the necessary roof trusses to go across the walls here and set up the gabled part of the roof. Now, because the entire building needs to break down into sections for painting, I'm going to construct the roof here as a lift-off section, so I can't glue the trusses to the walls yet. I will do that once everything is painted, and then I'll glue all of the individual components together. And so with all of the trusses constructed and their location marked out, my next step will be to put the planking on the roof so that it becomes one modular section that just lifts off of the walls. So the first thing I cut out were the top and bottom planks with the ends cut at a bevel to match the angle of the rear wall, and marking out the location of the individual trusses so that I could locate those relative to the planks and then glue the planks to the trusses. I cut them long at the front so that I could line up that angle at the back to where it ties into the backdrop, and then cut the fronts off to the exact length. Otherwise, it really would have been tricky to figure out the length here. Now, the bottom board here on the right side is set slightly up because this is the section that ties into the hip roof section. And so at the far end out here, there's a slight overhang, but only here at the front because the rest of this section is sitting up under the hip roof. So there will be one very short little section of planking here for the overhang, the eaves on the right side. Now, once I get all of the planks in place, I will cut down the length here at the front because, like I say, I'm putting all these planks on extra long so that I can easily just match the length to the front gable, which is actually prototype practice. That's what they would do on a real building. Now, because the gable is part of the walls and the entire roof section with trusses has to be able to lift off for painting, I'm just temporarily securing everything in place with blue painter's tape, and then I can take that off and dismantle the building and take it over to the paint booth. So now I can simply cut out the intervening planks here. I can match that angle at the back and then just let the front hang out and cut it later and glue these in place. Now, I'm not figuring out the exact width of the planks so that they line up perfectly between the upper and lower boards. I don't have to really figure out that exact width because what I'm going to do is put a spacing in between these boards and work out the difference that way, which again is prototype practice. The roof planks, as they're put on a building, would not be put tight up against each other. Quite often a roof would be shingled over with cedar shingles, and those need to be able to breathe. You don't want them to be tight against something at the bottom, and so by leaving a space in there, it allowed air to circulate up under the cedar shingles. Now, in my case, you're only going to be able to see this planking by looking inside the building and looking up through the trusses toward the planking. That's the only way you'll see them. And so it'll actually look kind of nice if there's a really definable seam there between the boards. I'm going to be roofing with corrugated galvanized roofing material here, which will all be wonderful and rusty, so you won't see any of this from above. And even in a prototype installation, that wouldn't require that the planks be tied up against each other. So you can see here, I'm just leaving a slight space in there as I work that out. And that way I don't have to figure out the exact width of these planks. I can just have these spaces in there. And again, this is the only way you'll see them, is if you look up inside here through the trusses, and you'll see that there's a slight space between the planks. So here again, I've got to secure the ends of the planks to the walls with blue painter's tape, since I can't glue them to the gables at either end. And you can see that now that I have the planks in place, I was easily able to recalculate that rear gable and rebuild that so that it matched the pitch on the roof. Before, it was really quite complicated to try to figure out. Now with the planks in place, it was very easy to build that rear gable. Now last week when we were on the fireworks train and we were looking around the yards here at the Nevada Northern, I was studying these hip roofs. A lot of hip roofs have been used over the years. And again, we talked about the affordability of a hip roof, and in some ways the simplicity. While they're really a nightmare to frame, they save a lot of building materials and they're incredibly strong. And so in an era they were really popular. They still are to some extent. But through the around 1900 all the way to around, the 1970s, 1980s, this was a really popular roof style. And earlier on, it was very common to see a combination of hip roofs and gabled roofs. So that's what I wanted to do here on the Handcar building. So if you remember from the first show, I actually constructed this entire building out of foam core so that I could figure out these angles, especially these really complicated angles where the hip roof ties into the gabled roof and that whole thing ties into the backdrop. The area underneath the hip roof is just open to the elements. There are no walls. And so the first thing I constructed were the beams that go on top of the legs that support the hip roof. In order to match the angle of the backdrop, I cut these out roughly and then finished that angle with my Northwest Shortline True Sander. We talked about that in the earlier video as well. It's a really handy tool to have. And then I assembled this on my assembly jig that I got at Micromart that uses these very powerful magnets and holds everything in place and in square while you glue it. So next I need the 4 legs that support the hip part of the roof. These 2 legs are the outermost legs, and they need to be wood grained as a lot of the wood has. And so using that same technique, I'm just dragging my Zonasaw across there to scratch a wood grain pattern into these legs. The 2 outer legs can now be glued to the framework. The inner legs will be attached to the building, but the outer legs are freestanding. I'm using the magnetic assembly jig here again in conjunction with an X-Acto right angle square to make sure that everything is nice and square. The inner 2 legs will be attached directly to the building, and since the hip roof section needs to be removable for painting, it will just slide on top of these 2 legs, which will support them. Eventually, of course, this will all be glued together, but for now, this whole framework will just stand on top of those legs. Okay, now to figure out how to frame a hip roof. So a quick trip over to Professor Google to find out just exactly what hip roof framing looks like and how it works. I find these various diagrams here and the names of all the different pieces. This is more like what I'm going to be building because it's a valley roof, and where my hip roof ties into the gabled roof, it will be a valley. In the case of this diagram, both sections of the roof are hip roof, where with mine, one section is gabled roof and the other section is hip roof, but the idea is the same. So I will still have a ridge board running down the center of the hip section, and then I will have the hip rafters extending off of that toward the corners of the structure, and the rafter jacks extending from the hip rafter to the outer edge of the building on the outside section, and the valley jacks extending from the ridge board down to the valley rafter. Yeah, it's going to be a little complicated. So, just like I had rafters on the gabled section, I will have two complete trusses here in the hip roof section. So I went ahead and put in three, I guess you could call them joists. I'm going to double these up. These won't be actually part of the truss. I just need them here for strength while I'm working. And so the trusses are going to set right up against these three joists, I guess we could call them. So, using the same template that I used for building the trusses for the gabled section, I will build the two trusses of the hip section. They have a subtle difference to them. They have a notch at the top here to hold the ridge board, and since they go up against the backdrop at the far end, they're cut off at the far end, so there's no point building out that far edge. So just as I did with the roof planks, I'm cutting these off longer than they need to be, and then I'll trim them to exact length once I know how they fit up against the backdrop. So aligning them with my square, I can then trim off the back exactly where it lines up with the backdrop, and then glue those up against the joists, making sure that they're perfectly square to the rest of the building. And now with the two trusses in place, I can set my ridge board, and you can see I've set one of my hip rafters in place as well as one of my valley jacks. I was having a lot of trouble getting the hip rafter to line up perfectly with the trusses. I set this piece of plastic in place just to check alignment. It seems that the exact position of the second truss relative to the corner of the building is going to set the angle here on the hip joist, and or the hip rafter, I guess it is. And so what I had to do was put a little block under the end of the hip rafter to hold that in place, just to get the alignment correct. Because the most important thing here is that when I put the planking on, that it line up perfectly with the rafters. And so for that reason, the inner hip rafters, the valley rafters, I'm going to add those later once the planking is in place, and just glue those in place from below. No reason why not. And so with the hip rafters in place for the front and the right side of this roof, I'm going to go ahead and start putting the planking on, and then fill in the other hip rafters once the planking is on these two sides. The hip rafter assembly over here is completely removable from the rest of the building, again so that I can paint the underside of it. And for that reason, I sort of missed the angle here at the valley on that first board, but it really won't matter. It won't show once the corrugated roofing is in place. Also, I sort of missed the length, I guess, on that first truss, and it's hanging out a little past the end of that first plank, so I'll just have to trim that off. That's no big deal. So after just a few minor adjustments here, I was ready to start planking up the front side of the building all the way to the ridge board. Again, just double checking everything, trying to get that angle at the valley correct now. I only missed that very first one, and the rest of them should line up perfectly. It's a little tricky because, again, this whole section is free to move around. I've also left out two of the jack rafters here because I think it'll be much easier to put those in once the planking is in place, unlike a prototype building where you can't do that. But because my entire hip roof assembly is removable, I can just roll that over and add jack rafters from the bottom. Keeping in mind that this is the only part of this structure that will show. The top will be covered over with the roofing material, and you'll only see this when you look up from below into the rafters. Now, the most complicated set of angles here is the rear of the building and the rear valley here. Because it ties into the backdrop, there's some really peculiar angles here. And I have to keep in mind this view from right here. It has to be straight across there so that it slides neatly up against the backdrop. The backdrop intersects the hip roof about an inch behind the ridge board. So there's some very interesting angles here to figure out. So I'm putting the planking in, working from the ridge board down, and then figuring out those angles where the planking intersects the backdrop. Here again is the angle that you'll actually be able to see this on the finished model. Notice here I've also put in 2 of the missing jack rafters. It looks much better. Okay, on to the doors. I'm actually using some Grant line castings. They're 1/2-inch scale, but they're of a larger door, so they actually work perfectly in this situation. I've had to widen the door frame to fit my opening, however, so I'm just splicing some pieces in here and then adding in a new casing that I'm making out of styrene. And of course, scoring a wood grain in here with my saw blade like I've done on the other exposed wood on the building. And so I think I pretty much have the basic structure assembled here. Give it some quick once over, a few adjustments, trim off some pieces that aren't quite right, and just make sure everything fits correctly and works correctly. And gee, I think I'm ready for paint. The only parts of the building I need to paint at this juncture will be the insides of the building and the doors, door casings, and window frames and that sort of thing. The outside of the building will be covered over with siding, and the roof will be covered over with corrugated metal, so those surfaces aren't going to require paint. Anyway, there it is. I love the look. This is exactly what I was after. A gabled building with a hip roof section, which is unenclosed for storage outside. Looks a bit like a gas station, doesn't it? Anyway, so much more work to be done. Next up, painting. And I hope you're going to want to follow along with this. So if you're not a subscriber to the channel, please subscribe. And you can do that by clicking on the upcoming blue button. Zoink! Right there, the blue button. Well, we're not sure how you found this video on the internet. We sure hope you didn't find it boring. And we will see you here again on Sunday. Bye-bye.